Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We were talking about reservations policy as a policy that was framed in the context of India's pursuit of equality. As I had mentioned in the previous lecture, development always came. Indian planning, Indian policies have always had twin objectives. Development always was tagged with equality, and in a way that this is done, that the development was tagged with equality. As a consequence, it has this twin policy, this policy of pursuing twin goals, has had some positive effects as far as nation building is concerned, but at the same time it has also this policy has also acted as a speed breaker on India's development. Therefore, it's very difficult to say whether we should have given up the idea of social equality, of equality at all when you pursue development. Incidentally, I want to mention that Lee Kuan Yew, the president of the Prime Minister of Singapore, and he and Jawaharlal Nehru were graduated at the same time from Oxford, from Cambridge, and Lee Kuan Yew deliberately pursued a policy which was opposed to socialist policies of Nehru. In fact, because of that, because actually he was also a socialist, but he made sure that he relied very much on promoting development through the private sector, through the market. And therefore, today it's staggering that Singapore's per capita income is several times. I think I mentioned it last time. Singapore's per capita income of Singapore is way beyond India's per capita income. So, Singapore has achieved tremendous strides, but at the same time, we really should not compare Singapore with India, because Singapore is only a small state. But having said this, I was talking about the Mandal Commission report, that is that reservations were extended to the other backward castes by the VP Singh government in 1989. This was a significant step in India's march to social equality, because this is at around this time the Dalits had become conscious, especially under the influence of Kanchiram, and he was promoting the idea of Dalit Bahujan Samaj, and he was promoting the idea of the Bahujan. Essentially, the Bahujan is that he said that all the castes who are not Savarna, that is the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas, all of them put together, all the castes and the minorities are put together, and the STs put together, they form a majority. Unfortunately, this majority is not ruling, has yielded power to the minority, and in order to seize the levers of power, what they have to do is to come together and oust them. So what is very interesting in this context is that the Mandal Commission report, when it was being implemented, these ideas were floating around, were becoming dominant. That means it was not so, it was not any longer about reservation of seats only, it was about acquiring power, getting power, getting empowered. This was the idea that was dominant, all right. But subsequent, the point that I would wish to make here is that these reservation policies, there are, very many positive things to be said about reservation policies, even in terms of social change. It promoted social mobility of the hitherto OBC, backward castes, and it promoted some kind of solidarity between the OBCs and the Dalits. Dalit consciousness also had risen at this, at this juncture. The consciousness of being Dalits, being the broken people. This was a new ideology was forming of about the Dalits, that they have to assert their difference to claim power. Be that as it may, this movement towards equality, social justice and equality was a very powerful movement. It churned up the society, especially in North India. In South India, it had already churned up the society, and many of the members of the backward caste have really made progress in terms of social mobility. But in North India, it was a real, it produced a real churning effect. And the point that I want to make here is that as powerful as it was, this movement, you see, the government, what shall I say, the objectives of the government could easily afford to ignore several vital functions that it had to perform, both at the level of the center and at the level of the states. Why do I say that? You see, the politicians and political leaders realized that in order to attain power, in order to get votes, all that they have to do is to mobilize people, talk the language of reservations and equality. The people they didn't have to do very much about bringing about institutional reforms that were required. They didn't have to do very much about investing in industries. As I was saying, this pursuit of equality, by the discourse of the pursuit of equality, gave a easy way out for the political parties and political leaders to do nothing. They didn't have to do anything to bring about institutional reforms, to build new institutions, to ensure that their policies are well implemented and so on, because all that a politician has to do is to make very credible promises of providing reservations for different castes and communities. They didn't really have to bother to ensure whether these once having given reservations to these communities, whether the government is working properly, effectively, whether the schools and colleges are working effectively and so on. In fact, it's possible to point out that the various institutions, governmental institutions, bureaucracy and educational institutions started declining because of colleges and universities started declining, the quality started declining because the government, along with reservations, did not follow that up with attempts to ensure that these institutions also work efficiently and produce the right results, because that there was no pressure on the politicians, or no political pressures at all on the for them to turn their attention to these issues. In fact, things became worse for another reason. While on the one hand the pursuit of equality changed, is the discourse of the pursuit of equality changed from secular class considerations to caste. All right, it became caste. There was another thing was happening along with it. This is especially in Indira Gandhi's era, the idea of poverty eradication, by the government, introduced a whole set of economic policies which were aimed at distributing resources to the poor. You see, instead of the point is that redistribution of resources to the poor, to the needy, became a very important plank of the government's agenda. It became such an important, by adopting such redistributive policies, the government could, sort of win over, the poor and make them vote for them, because by giving them a feeling that the government is with them. And this policy this is populist policies, was so successful when Indira Gandhi implemented it, that other governments, other political parties also started following that. As a consequence, also, as the distributive mechanism had so many holes, the government's distributive mechanisms had so many holes that before the benefits reach the beneficiary, many of the resources were drained away by middlemen who amassed money. In fact, it contributed to inequalities. In the name of equality, it promoted inequalities and corruption also. And then these bureaucrats became very powerful and alongside, because they had to they dealt with huge amounts of resources, and they had to take the discretionary power of interpreting the law was so enormous that even big business leaders had to go and wait in their rooms, queue up and wait in their rooms to get appointments. But the main issue is that in the name of equality, in the pursuit of equality, also eroded the functioning of the government, both when in terms of when the populist policies were undertaken, and through reservations, because the government did not, first of all, I don't think the government had the resources to undertake such huge programs and policies. On the other hand, the government did not have the will also, did not have the inclination also. The political leaders also didn't have the inclination, because here the political leaders can in public appear to be catering to the needs of the deprived communities, but actually in the name of the deprived communities, they can monopolize the resources that were meant for them. So this was a double advantage for the politicians and the bureaucrats. So what I am trying to say, and then third is that the government also, the slew of uh, populist policies extended to other decisions the government made, economic decisions the government made. For instance, when the farmers agitated, the government of the farmers had genuine grievances. Whenever they agitated, the government yielded to them. They gave them, they allowed them free electricity, free water supply. They gave them. They also gave them fertilizers at subsidized prices, and other kinds of subsidies were introduced. The government gave these these subsidies to the farmers and to other sections of the community. And therefore, what happened was that the fact that these subsidies were being given meant that economic growth, this is providing subsidies, is by providing these subsidies, actually you are not promoting economic growth and productivity. In fact, you are harming it, because the subsidies will be wastefully used, as in the case of urea, for instance. The subsidy on urea was such that subsidy on fertilizer was such that farmers everywhere started using urea. Urea is harmful, all right, and excessive use of urea actually led to the declining yield of declining agricultural yields. Today, farmers in Punjab, the agricultural yields in Punjab have come down enormously. Earlier it was the wheat basket of the country after Green Revolution, but now it has come down enormously because of the excessive use of fertilizers, and therefore because of the loss of fertility of the soil. So these policies, instead of promoting development, all right, acted as brakes on development. Acted as brakes on development. And the crucial, it was only realized subsequently when Manmohan Singh's government set up this the Knowledge Commission. The Knowledge Commission made a report saying that given India's population, we need to have many, several, in order to cater to India's advancement, we need many more engineering colleges, many more medical colleges. We need institutions of excellence in large number, central universities, and so on in large numbers. And it was, and it's an astonishing fact that none of the governments cared to, sort of consider these, consider the health of educational institutions as a priority. Socialist policies, were counterproductive for yet another reason, because public sector units, the performance of public sector units was, were appalling. Public sector units, many of these public sector units were making losses. The government had to, that's because the work relations in public sector units were such that nobody was responsible for, to ensure that there is efficiency and that workers worked, were at the station. In fact, it's very interesting that in a study of the Bhilai steel plant, of the workers in the Bhilai steel plant, the anthropologist says many of the workers go to the plant and then find a nice place to a cool place to go, sleep and sit and relax most of the time. And they say that basically, and there's also another report in Bangalore. There were so many public sector units operating, HAL, HMT and Bharat Electronics. So many public sector units were operating, and one of these cynical critics said that they're making such huge losses that if they close down their operations, and if they say that they tell the workers that they will be paid, their salaries will be sent home, the country will be saving huge amount of resources, because by going to the factories, they are not actually adding value to the to the national income. In fact, they are taking away value from the national income. So the point is that the socialist policies were such that there was this for instance, the government protected several industries, right? Now the production of steel, for instance, in the country, it was the cost of manufacturing steel in India. The price of steel in the market in India was so high, it was higher than the price of steel price of steel produced abroad, and it was calculated that even after paying all the import duties, the price of steel would still be, the imported steel will still be lower than the steel produced within the country. This means that these public sector units were actually draining national resources, because it is all taxpayers' money. The workers are not thrown out of jobs. The workers are retained. All right. So much of fixed investments have been made. Talking about public sector units, they were so unproductive that maintaining them would be a loss of public resources, and would be a drain on country's economy. So, not only that, in the government, in its zeal for socialist reforms, it had also introduced this Industrial Disputes Act. The Industrial Disputes Act, made sure that if a private enterprise wants to dismiss a worker, it has to get the government's permission. If they want to, throw some people out of jobs because they are no longer needed, they cannot just, say goodbye to you. They will have to, get the permission of the government. Industrial Disputes Act made sure that you have to get the permission of the government. This meant that private enterprises had no incentive to enlarge their production, because enlarge the scale of production, enlarge their units, because if they enlarge their units, they need more workers, and if they employ workers more than 20 or more than 20 workers, then they will come under this Industrial Disputes Act, and therefore they'll have to, they'll find it difficult to throw their, when they are unable to, when they are making losses, they cannot, avoid making more losses by, by keeping the workers. So they preferred not to employ, they preferred not to employ laborers. They always wanted to, their preference was to invest in machinery, in capital, so that they can increase production without having had to employ workers. In fact, this Industrial Dispute Act led to the phenomenon, it contributed, I think, to the expansion of the unorganized sector, because these large industrial units, one way of increasing their production is to subcontract their work to smaller units, and these smaller industrial units operated in the informal sector, where these government regulations and laws could not be effectively implemented. So what and then there the workers' interests were not, it would not be very easy for the government to find out whether the workers' interests are taken care of, whether the workers are working, whether the workers are not being exploited. Actually in the unorganized sector, most of the workers employed were basically women and children. And there are notorious cases of exploitation of women and children in the unorganized sector, and they had to work for long hours. They had to sometimes they would be imprisoned in cages, all right, almost in cages, and they are not allowed to go out. It was some kind of a slavery, all right, and in these in these units, in these smaller units, not all of them, in these smaller units, these the wages that the workers get also could not be regulated, because government couldn't make sure that they get a fair wage for the work they did, or they did not do they were not exploited and made to work for longer hours than for very long hours. So the point is that by these socialist policies, not only that this did productivity suffer, but also the the very purpose of introducing progressive labor reforms was defeated, because in the unorganized sectors, which in the unorganized sector of the economy, accounted for nearly 90% of the workforce. And that being the case, nobody is able to give a correct figure. We only infer that by saying that only we know that in the organized sector how many workers are employed, because they are registered companies. So in the unorganized sector, we push all the rest into the unorganized sector. So in the unorganized sector of the economy was expanding, and this means that primitive labor relations prevail. Even if the primitive labor relations prevail, and if exploitation occurred, the government could do very little. So this means socialist policies were introduced to defeat equality. So this is the point that I want to stress, that one way socialist policies, especially policies of also these distributive policies and policies of reservations, all right, contributed to nation building. You see, because everyone felt that in the case of distributive policies that the government adopted, populist policies, the poor felt, the marginal and the oppressed felt that there was, after all, the government is my bap, they will come to our aid. So this, their rebellious instinct was curbed, all right. On the other hand, that in the context of caste reservations, most of the people, all the castes which are earlier, marginalized, they all felt that they had a stake in the Indian nation, in the Indian India as a nation, the idea of India. So, as a consequence, that this promoted a sense of national unity. After all, if my number doesn't come today, a day later, sometime later, if I can't get into, if I'm a laborer and if I can't, aspire to become a big officer in the government, at least I can hope that my son or daughter can become an officer in the government because of these reservations policies. That means the people felt, even the poor and the marginal felt that they had a stake in India's democracy. The point about the reservation policy was that it gained an autonomous momentum, in the sense that once reservations on the basis of castes were introduced, the issue of other neglected categories came up, gradually. Of course, there was this the feminist movement in the 1970s. It, as I have already talked about it, it led to the women's movement, and the women's movement in the beginning was concentrating on women's right to equality, and this women's right to equality, in the initial phases of the movement, it was basically focused on issues like dowry, because dowry deaths were rampant, and the women's groups organized themselves to, and then there was also this report of on the status of women in India, which was published in 1974. All these reports gave a fillip to the women's movement, and dowry became a dominant issue in politics, in the political circles, in the political discourse. So, as a consequence, the government passed a act banning dowry, all right. So that and then it imposed severe punishments on those who are held guilty of demanding dowry. And those people, also the laws were, modified to, in favor of the bride to such an extent that, the proof of the onus of proof lay with the, you see, usually in law, in our Indian law, the onus of proof lies with the accuser, all right. But here, the onus of proof lies with the defendant. If somebody comes and tells you that you are guilty, then the onus of proof of saying that you are not guilty rests on you. It doesn't rest on the person who is accusing you. Similarly, this was the dowry law that the government introduced, and once after this, there were many complaints against this dowry law, misuse of dowry law, but it remains. Just as even in the case of Dalits, in this Atrocities Act was passed, right? This which says that Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Act, which comes down heavily on atrocities against Dalits, atrocities against Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes. It punishes those if a member of the scheduled caste accuses a person of using abusive language against him or perpetrating violence on him, the police have to go immediately and arrest the person. And it's only then, even without any investigation, and it's still, there was a big controversy over it. The Supreme Court said that, you should revise this because it is unfair. But I think, the leaders of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes scheduled caste leaders especially say that if you dilute the law, then scheduled castes who are oppressed, will not go to the police in the first place, because they know that their oppressors can easily get away. If they are not arrested, they can take revenge on them. But this kind of law has been passed even in the context of atrocities against the Dalits. Now, to continue the story further on women's reservations, you see, subsequently, after this dowry bill, the women's reservation movement focused on this reservation of seats in the parliament, in the panchayats and local bodies, and in the parliament. When Rajiv Gandhi introduced reservations for women in the panchayat bodies very successfully, there was another bill passed to ensure 33% reservation for women in the parliament. It is, the parliament, the lower house of the parliament passed the bill, but it is stuck in the upper house, that is the Rajya Sabha. The Rajya Sabha still is yet to pass it, and it has taken more than, I think it has become 2 decades, more than 2 decades, since the bill is stuck in the Rajya Sabha. You see, it's very interesting to examine why it's stuck in the Rajya Sabha, because the women's, this women's reservation bill is regarded, as undermining the hold of the backward castes, OBCs. In fact, Mulayam Singh Yadav in the parliament once said that if the bill is passed, then we will not, instead of banging the tables in the Lok Sabha, we will be banging our khatiyas in our villages, because women will take over. There is a fear that women will take over. And I think there is a very strong, what's called regarding women's rights, there is a very strong undercurrent, a cultural undercurrent, which resists giving equal rights for women for a variety of reasons. One, if women are given equal rights, and if they are allowed to, go out and work, and they are also allowed to their given freedom, they also become political leaders and so on. What will happen to the men is a very big question, because many of these castes, all these castes and communities, even religious communities, Muslims, Hindus and others, consider women as the markers of their caste or community boundary. Now, if a woman gets educated, gets a job, and she, has the right to choose her own partner, all right, it's not likely that the woman would choose a partner according to the wishes of her parents or of her community. In fact, this became a very serious problem in the case of Bora women. Bora women, Boras are a very progressive community. Boras have Boras are Muslims. It's a Muslim sect. Bora women are, many of them, there's a section of Bora society which encourages women to to get educated and to join professions and become independent earners. But as this is happening, these women find that they are able to, they can choose their own partners, all right. But in the Bora community, the imam in the community is the decision maker, chief decision maker. He has to give the permission to the women to marry, and quite often, and the imam rejects, especially when the Bora women want to marry men from outside the community. He outright rejects, and this went to the court. And some of the lawyers argued that this Bora community is such a small community that if you allow their women to marry outside the community will dwindle and disappear. So, because it's a minority community, minority community within a minority, you should restore the power of the Bora imam to restrain the brides of the Bora brides from marrying outside. So, this means that you are actually violating the right to freedom of Bora women. But this kind of contradiction occurs. But why I am saying this is that this kind of the right to women, if the women acquire the right to freedom fully, there will be a very, very big crisis in the context of community ties. You see, already there are, whether even among the Muslims, among the Mayo Muslims, there was in Rajasthan, there were incidents of a Mayo Muslim. Mayos consider themselves as Rajputs, former Rajputs, as a high caste. And there was an incident of a Mayo girl, eloping with a Muslim boy, but belonging to a lower caste. So that there was, it led to nearly a riot situation, and the boy was beaten up. And I think, I think he was, he was beaten up very badly, and the marriage and the girl was taken away by the parents. Similarly, there are incidents of Jat girls, all right, violating the caste codes. Why does it happen? Because if our girls go away from our community, all right, and marry outside, especially marry down, our status, public status will go down. And same, in Tamil Nadu, there is violence, people are killed. You see what happens, women, there is a higher caste girl, who is working in a, who goes to the university and working in becomes an engineer and works in an office, and she, finds, she falls in love with a, lower caste, a non-touchable, youth, very handsome and very bright, and she, decides to get married, walks out of the home and decides to get married, and what happens? There, his parents marshals, all the Muslimen of the dominant caste, all right? That's a higher caste and dominant caste. Muscles, marshals all of them, and they have killed that man in broad daylight in front of a mall. And this is the kind of thing. The same thing happens in the case of, we have had incidents in North India of a Hindu boy marrying a Muslim girl and being shot. Hindu man marrying a Muslim girl and being shot. What does all this indicate? that there is an underlying current which is anxious about preserving the community boundaries, the caste and community boundaries. And this caste and community boundaries was being preserved by the by reservations, because it ensured that these castes can get consolidated, can consolidate their privileges. All right. Now comes a situation, because of these reservations policies itself, there are more Dalits coming into the becoming professionals, becoming middle class. So as a consequence, what happens? There will be this kind of intermingling occurring in public spaces, secular spaces. How will how will you prevent these women from meeting others unless you put them in burqa? All right. So consequently, this, I think, is women's rights is likely to be very powerful churner of society, and that's why somehow or the other the society is putting brakes. Fortunately, now after the economic reforms, fortunately, I think you see what happened was, if you look at the women's movement, women are no longer bothered about reservations. No, they have because of the education that they have received, because of their own consciousness. All right, they have become independent professionals. They have joined government services and so on. So as a consequence of this, what you find is women are entering the workplace, especially at the higher levels. Of course, labor participation of women goes down in the rural areas, because as women move up the hierarchy, their family withdraws the women from working. Whereas in urban areas, especially in the middle classes, as women women as they get educated, their participation in work increases. And when this participation in work increases, then all these churning processes occur in the society, and along with it, the women's issues have changed now. Now, no longer it is about it's about dowry case. Although the dowry issues prevail, but mostly women's attention, the attention of public attention has now turned towards rape of women, sexual harassment of women in public places, especially after that Nirbhaya incident that occurred in Delhi in 2016. This has been the case. 2012, isn't it? In 2016, I think. No, December 16, 2012. So after this, the government has passed another bill, another act, soon after this, to protect the women's interests, women from harassment in public places, and it has imposed severe penalties on the offenders, along the lines, here again, the offenders have to prove that they are not guilty. It's the onus lies on the offenders and not on the women who accuse them. And also, women are protected in a variety of ways. So this is also an attempt to move towards equality. The democracy has pushed our society, our public discourse, in the direction of giving women greater rights. Actually, equality today is all about rights of women, or it's all about rights everywhere. Even when Dalit, Rohit Vemula, that Dalit student leader, committed suicide. He wrote a letter saying that his suicide note clearly was talking about the rights of Dalits. He wanted to, he is no longer about reservations, no longer about equality. It's about right, the civic right that the government, that the state has to protect. So this equality discourse has changed its color. So in all, what I want to say is that equality, the discourse of equality, has promoted the idea of India, all right. There is yet another contradiction that this pursuit of equality has generated. That is the contradiction, this caste reservations, has produced, caste reservations are supposed to be, you see, this is very interesting. Reservation of caste is regarded as a secular measure, all right, a secular policy. But see how this reservation, caste reservation becomes, attains communal color. Because if you look, if you see the leaders of the Ayodhya movement, right, you will find the leaders in most of the communal incidents, all right, most of them are drawn from the OBCs and the SCs, all right. They are the more aggressive the more aggressive Ram Bhakts, all right, than than others, than the upper caste who are supposed to be the champions of Hinduism, all right. Now this is very interesting that the beneficiaries of the reservation policies, only Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav, and I think to certain extent Mulayam Singh Yadav, the OBC leaders, remain progressive seculars. They advocate secularism. Or the remaining, especially the OBCs which do not belong to the dominant caste community, dominant caste, all right, like Yadavs, they've all joined forces with the Hindutva, all right. One of the scholars, Kancha Ilaya, once said that there is some false consciousness in them. Actually, they should be progressive. They should join anti-communal forces. They should regard the Muslims as their brothers, all right. But why is it that it's not happening? I think because that when you move up the social hierarchy, when you get better jobs, when you get more facilities, all right, then your attention turns to your social status. And because your attention turns to social status, you want to do, this is a process of Sanskritization. You want to, this also happens amongst the Muslims, when the Muslims become prosperous, they become more Islamicized, they turn to religion, they become more ritualistic, more orthodox, right. The same way these communities and castes, become religious, and we tend to become more, we tend to assert their Hindu, customs. Actually, in many cases in Uttar Pradesh, before 2014, the Dalits actually clashed with Muslims over the issue of, over the issue of Dalits, using loudspeakers to, on the in the temples to broadcast bhajans, all right, which irritated the Muslims. So this is a very interesting phenomenon that's developing. So the pursuit of equality is producing contradictions, several internal contradictions which cannot, which it's very difficult to see how these contradictions work themselves out. But in the one last point I would like to mention here is that all said and done, till now the nation building efforts have succeeded in spite of these clashes that are occurring from within. But now there is a very big threat to our national unity, and this threat comes from the fact, from the operation of forces at the global level. At globalization has, I've already said this in the earlier lectures, globalization is generating forces of, very powerful forces of religious fundamentalism. That is, religious fundamentalism means that especially in Islam and in Christianity, fundamentalist forces, fundamentalist ideas have taken root, and that's as I was saying earlier, this is also the reaction to the barrenness of just material prosperity, of the crass materialism that economic development has produced all over the world. And they find that this economic development, the materialist consumerism that that globalization has produced is becoming godless, is leading people towards godlessness, towards they don't. In order to counter this, especially among the Muslims, we say we are living in an immoral society. We should work to ensure that this is the kingdom of Allah. Therefore, and they are bound as Muslims to propagate Allah as the only God. And therefore, they take to these fundamentalist, they become fundamentalists. Many young men influenced by these versions of Islam, now quiz their fathers, don't go and keep the money in banks, all right, because it gives interest. It's anti-Islamic. It is not Islamic. It's halal. If you don't send my sister, unless she has covered her head. So this kind of trend is coming, and these fundamentalist trends have produced the reaction against fundamentalism in the country, which is trending to polarize. Yet, I think given the cultural diversity of India, I think this polarization can be muffled by policies, especially I think if you promote the interests of women, if you give them their right to equality and right to freedom, right to choose their grooms, then I think these polarizing tendencies can be bridged. Thank you so much.